Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Suitable Agency and Sunder Nursery, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to today's session of Suitable Conversations at Sunder Nursery. At a Suitable Agency, our love for all things books is what inspired the idea for this series, and we're extremely grateful to Sunder Nursery for their enthusiastic support and encouragement in making this happen. Without their collaboration, this series would not be possible. Now, for the event we've all been waiting for, Shrayana Bhattacharya will be discussing her book, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence. She will be in conversation with Snigdha Poonam. I'll read a few brief words about the speakers. Shrayana Bhattacharya trained in development economics at Delhi University and Harvard University. Since 2014, in her role as an economist with the World Bank, she has focused on issues related to social policy and jobs. Prior to this, she worked on research projects on women and labor with the Center for Policy Research, the SEWA Union, and the Institute of Social Studies Trust. Her writing has appeared in the Indian Express, the Hindustan Times, the Economic and Political Weekly, Indian Quarterly, and The Caravan. Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh is her first book. She lives in New Delhi. Snigdha Poonam is a journalist and writer. Her first book, The Dreamers, How Young Indians Are Changing the World, won 2018's Crossword Book Award for nonfiction. She has reported on national affairs for the Hindustan Times in Delhi. Her journalism has also appeared in Scroll, The Times of India, The New York Times, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and The Financial Times. And now, without further ado, please let's all give a round of applause for Shrayana and Snigdha.
Shaina, I wanted to begin by asking you about your first memory of Shah Rukh Khan. Well, firstly, let me start by thanking you, Snigdha, for being here today with me. Snigdha has read multiple versions of this book's draft over many years. Snigdha, I think I saw Shah Rukh the first time in Bazigar, which is a very dangerous film actually for a 11-year-old or 12-year-old. I think I was around that age to see because essentially he's killing women, he's putting them in suitcases. There's a lot of very dangerous stuff going on. I saw it in, yes, tossing them off buildings, all kinds of terrible things. He's harming women, and I saw this, and for some reason, all I remember from that film, I saw it in Kolani, which is a small town on the outskirts of Calcutta, where my grandmom and granddad, maternal family, live, and I'd been sent there for holidays. And they used to live right across a railway station, and right across on the other side of the house there was a cinema hall. And I was sent off there with a cousin of mine. And I saw this film, and the only thing I remember is Kali Kali Aankhein, and that song. It stayed with me, and I danced and sang to it to my heart's delight. And then, I saw Bazigar. I think the story and what was going on had no real impact on me. I think I just remember the song and dance and the fact that this man seemed really attractive. I think even for a 12-year-old at that point, I was slowly, I think, coming into that phase of life. And then I saw him in Kabhi Haan Kabhi Na, where he plays a loser in love. And that was, I was about to turn 13, and you are dealing with feeling like an outcast in school. And there was something about the way he played someone who never really fit in. And that was very important. But what I really remember when you asked me if when was the first time I saw him, and was Zehen mein kab aaya, when did you start to internalize the imagery? It has to be the interviews. I used to come back home, and once in a while he'd be on Sony television talking about being middle class. And I write this in the book. Along with me, so many young women would tell me that the word middle class entered their dictionary because of him, because he would keep talking about it in his interviews, that I'm middle class, I come from a certain background, talking about his economic scenario, which was very unusual. I'd never heard anyone be so open about their hardships or their anxieties about competition. And so I think it would be those three periods. I mean, between that early 90s period when there was Bazigar, Kabhi Haan Kabhi Na, and then the big interviews.
That's really interesting. I didn't grow up a big Shah Rukh Khan fan. My sisters were, but I grew up very aspirational in small towns of several small towns of Jharkhand, and I remember watching my first Shah Rukh Khan memory is watching an interview with him, and I'm so glad that you put it in the book because my Shah Rukh Khan fantasy was to speak English like him, and I'm reading the book. turned out that there were so many women who felt the same way. But there must be so at least few people here who don't know what the book is about. So I know you've done this so many times, but if you could explain what the book is about and how you came to write it.
Thanks, Snigdha. The book happened as a complete accident. I have to be very transparent about that. If I claimed any sense of design, then that's a lie. It was a set of encounters. There was sheer accident, upon which then I was able to lay a sense of structure and purpose. It was 2006. Some of you may have heard me say this story before. It was 2006. I was in my early 20s. I was young and I was foolish, and I just studied economics in the way they traditionally teach you at Delhi University, where you believe that quantitative data will describe everything that is useful to tell about a human being. And I really believed that I would go out there, collect all this data, and save the country with all the information that I would collect. And of course, I was working for a feminist think tank called the Institute of Social Studies Trust. I was sent to a low income neighborhood in Ahmedabad, this place called Bapu Nagar, where a lot of women were involved in making agarbattis, incense sticks at home. They were making about a quarter of minimum wage. And I was sent there as part of a research project to essentially ask them about their economic conditions, their wages, their labor rights. And when I showed up all excited in my early 20s with the hubris of economics, what I found was a bunch of people who were just really bored. They were really not interested in answering my questions. They thought they were tedious. These were women who were unionizing. They were actively fighting for their own labor rights. They were fighting with employers. They were extremely cognizant of their own economic deprivations and circumstances. They didn't need someone from the outside coming in to ask them and to remind them. And so in research, you're taught you take a break, right? So in the book, I describe this as a research recess. And we started taking breaks and we started talking about things that we all found some form of entertainment or found delight in. And when we started talking about the few things that joined all of us together, I started asking people about their favorite actors. And lo and behold, there was Shah Rukh. And I'm a big fan. I met women who were big fans. And suddenly at that point, Snigdha, the tone and texture of the conversations just opened up. And I think, like any of us, all of these women were far more interested in talking about what delighted them, what they enjoyed, as opposed to the deprivations and the poverty that they were facing in their everyday lives. And once I started asking them more about, well, why do you like Shah Rukh? And, the kind of question you just asked me, how did you see him? I started to realize that suddenly these stories about fandom were a very refreshing lens to hear about women's economic lives, because we tend to think that fandom is just a personal preference, it's just your taste. But fandom is an economic activity as well. To follow the work of an artist, to unambiguously adore the work of an artist, requires free time for leisure, money, access to markets, access to media. And all of these women were struggling to actually be able to access any of these attributes to enjoy a film. And yet they struggled to do so. That's how much they loved him. And I was really struck by this, and I decided to follow up on this story. And so, for more than a decade, because from Ahmedabad, I went to rural Uttar Pradesh for research projects, then to Jharkhand. And I met a series of women, and the book essentially tells a story of these women from different class backgrounds. They're divided by religion, caste, various attributes of community, but what really unites them is their desire to want to watch Mr. Khan. And in telling that story, they started telling me about their economic realities in a much more open way over obviously a very long period of time. And I followed up every time Shah Rukh had a release. I'd talk to them. Every time there was a festival, we'd chat. I was bobbing along, I think, in their lives. And in 2013, at some point, I decided that I did not only want this book or this project to only focus on women who were from working class backgrounds and in low income communities. I think there was a very interesting cross class story here to tell, given that Shah Rukh's core fan base has also been the emerging middle class, the English speaking elite, NRIs as well to some extent. And I wanted to follow up on that story, so I opened up the set of women that I was speaking with. And the book is essentially a telling, an intimate telling of what the period between economic liberalization into economic lockdown has felt like for a very diverse group of women. And I think
felt is the emphasis is on felt, because often when we write about the economy or people's economic lives, it's a bunch of stuffy statistics, and you and we've talked about this often. And I wanted to tell a story about what those statistics are really hiding and what sentiments they hold. And I found in Mr. Khan this very unusual research device to actually allow me to do that. And that's the book.
There is, in fact, a really wide range of women's stories in the book. There are these agarbatti makers from Ahmedabad. There's a migrant domestic worker from Jharkhand who comes to Delhi. There's a high-flying air hostess who lives in Gurgaon. There's a housewife from a royal family, and yet there are, I mean, reading the book, it was clear to me that some of their anxieties were common, but I wanted you to talk about, what were, um, this is a really wide range of women across socioeconomic class, but what were some of the things that you found common about their lives, and what counted as privilege in their world, and how did Shah Rukh Khan fill the gaps that they were facing in their intimate lives or in their workplaces?
Thanks, Snigdha. You know, the book subtitle is India's Lonely Young Women, and I think it's a bit of a hat tip to India's Angry Young Men, which is from. I see it very much as a bit of a jugalbandi between the two. And what was common amongst all the women I met across class, caste, all regions in the book certainly. Uh, there are nearly eight. I mean, there are 10 stories that I follow in depth over a period of time, but then I've interviewed around hundreds of women who are fans. And it's this sense of loneliness. They're all lonely, and they're lonely in sort of three attributes to that loneliness. And I think the book is trying to give the reader a flavor of that. One is they're lonely in the workplace, and all the women in the book are actively trying to hold on to a job, actively trying to find a job, actively trying to essentially stand on their own two feet economically, which I think, as many of us here may know, it's a really remarkable thing to try and do, given that India is now in the bottom five when it comes to the share of women in the workplace. Women's labor force participation rates have just completely plummeted since 2004, 2005, and there's a series of reasons for that, and I get into that in the book. And so they're lonely because they're trying to essentially defy a social script which says a woman's role is essentially as a married mother, fundamentally. And I think that's the script that each one of the women is defying. And when she does that, in economics, there's a great interest nowadays in these ideas of what economists like Sendil Mullainathan call hidden taxes. And the idea is that each time you start to deviate from something that is a standard social script, in your interpersonal life, people will make you feel unworthy, unloved. You will be emotionally taxed in one way or the other. And I think the loneliness that a lot of the women are expressing in the book through the stories, and I think the loneliness I've tried to capture, is because each one of them is trying to essentially stand on her own two feet economically. So that's one. So I think they're lonely in the labor force. They're also lonely in the kitchen. And again, there's enough data that shows that women in India are essentially bearing this massive burden of domestic drudgery. And if you choose to work outside the home, you're managing deadlines, dishes, and dignity all on your own with very little support and help. India right now it's in the bottom five again when it comes to the share of men who help in housework with countries like Pakistan and Korea. And it's interesting that each of the women I spoke to would complain that none of the men help. And that's the power of Mr. Khan, because in all his movies, when you talk to all these women about Mr. Khan, the first thing they'll say is, well, he always helps women. He's in the kitchen in DDLJ, he's cutting vegetables. Even in the latest interview that he did with David Letterman, which was the last time he was on the big screen, well, for us on Netflix anyway, he was cooking for David Letterman, making chicken or something like that. And he was actively, and even if it's a ruse or if it's an act, it's something that all these female fans who I followed really appreciated, because they felt, well, at least someone's putting up the act of trying to help women with their domestic burdens. And in their real lives, they're so incredibly lonely in the kitchen and in caring. And I think the third kind of loneliness is perhaps something that would be across genders, but certainly I pick it up in the book because I choose to follow women in the book, is a kind of, it sounds lofty, but a kind of existential loneliness for constantly having to hustle for feeling loved. So all of these women are constantly being told, if you behave like this, then I will love you. If you choose to leave the workforce, I will love you. If you choose a certain waistline, I will love you. If you treat the kids a certain way, I will love you. Each one is constantly, essentially hustling to feel loved, to feel admired, to feel respected. And I think in Mr. Khan, they found escape from that hustling for love, this very transactional culture of love that we have now, because essentially he has wide open arms. It's this soppy candy floss image that many of us will just laugh at, but you realize the spiritual function and the psychological function that they're playing is because all these women are just feeling so unloved and having to constantly jump through hoops to be loved. And he is essentially servicing this need to be unconditionally admired. And I would argue that women and people from marginalized groups in this country obviously have to hustle more to be loved just for who you are, if you choose to again deviate from scripts. And I think that's the power of Mr. Khan, that he is escape, he's comfort, he's fun. In some cases, he's also a model of aspiration, which I think you started with when you were talking about him, and we'll get into it a bit more, depending on your class position. But he is essentially love. He's love when women are feeling lonely in the workforce, lonely in the kitchen, lonely because they're constantly having to hustle to just be who they are. And I think that's what's common amongst all of them, is that sense of loneliness.
And yet he's not a perfect man in most of his movies. He's in fact played some really flawed characters. But one of the things that you said somewhere, and I found really funny, is that no matter how bad a person he's playing in a film, I think whether it's a stalker or a narcissist prick, there is a point in the film, maybe a section or whatever, where he'll give something up for a woman, whether it's an ice cream, or a job, or his life, or I don't know. I think this is you'll have to read the book. And you insist that he's not a feminist icon, but a female icon, and I think that it's been interesting to dig into that.
Yeah, the thing is, I actually say this in the book very, and in fact, the book is in service of this idea that each one of us, we can choose to see what we want to see, right? So I know that there's a very lazy binary making of, well, he's done Dar, where he's stalking a woman. So then the entire career is, toxic, as they would say, and then as a consequence, if you like him, there's a kind of regressiveness that you're signing up for. But none of the women in the book are at all, they would subscribe to anything, they don't like Dar. And something that actually I say in the book, none of the women like him. They like the songs in the movie. They like him in the songs in the movie. They choose to focus on those aspects of it where they find, joy, fun, exhilaration, delight, comfort. But they're not interested in scripts that make women feel unsafe, harmed, and that's a distinction that I found, especially amongst English-speaking fans, particularly. They would constantly make that distinction, and I think that speaks to this idea that he may not subscribe to, or his film certainly will not subscribe to. I don't know him as a person. I wish I did. The films may not subscribe to feminist ideals, but women can still choose to find aspects of that filmography which they find work for them, give them joy, comfort, consolation, that they find interesting. I also think there's something very interesting, Snigdha, where anytime women are gushing unambiguously about a man, it immediately, and I noticed this when I was doing the interviews, it immediately makes people feel so uncomfortable. And it's not just the men who are feeling uncomfortable, everyone in their interpersonal lives are feeling really uncomfortable. Largely because what is it? You're essentially voicing your sexual desires. And in a country which is obsessed because of caste and notions of purity, to do nothing but constantly control and obsess over female sexuality, the fact that all these women are out there saying, well, we really like the way Shah Rukh Khan looks and we like the way he behaves and loves, it makes many people feel very uncomfortable. And so then immediately you want to dismiss it. And one thing I will say is that I think on this issue of he's playing terrible men, and yet the women can choose to ignore what they want to. They recognize it for what it is, and you see that in the book very clearly. There's tremendous nuance and selection in the way the female gaze is approaching Mr. Khan's work. And I think that's also important because often we tend to think, well, when women are saying things about men, it's just foolish, you're nagging, you're just being, a woman, right? But actually, if you listen very carefully to the things that they're saying, these are not foolish love adders, spectators of a great man's charisma, right? They are all actively constructing him. And someone asked me recently when I speak about him in like public forums, I'll always say he's Mr. Khan because he's actually a real person who I don't know. But actually, Shah Rukh, in the book, everybody calls him Shah Rukh, and that's because we've all co-created this Shah Rukh. He does not exist. I mean, he's a co-creation of each of the women in the book is creating this idea of him based on their realities, their aspirations, and it's not the case, often in the media, particularly in film media, I notice the way people write about stars and male stars particularly is that they're just so charismatic that everyone is bewitched by them. I don't think that that's true at all. In fact, what the stories in the book tell me is that, of course, he's charismatic, but actually, all these women are constantly interacting and negotiating with parts and pieces of his filmography. So, to women in the upper middle class and elite women, he is essentially a sign of upward social mobility. And so they approach him that when there are stories in the book that speak to this. For women who come from working class backgrounds, he is the first opportunity to find a mate on your own. That's even an option, right? And he's a city boy. He represents very different things to different women. There's a character in the book who's a domestic worker from Jharkhand who moves to Jorbag to work here, and to her, she's obsessed with this film called Rab Ne Bana Di Jodi, which if any of you have not seen, please go see it. There's this fabulous scene where essentially he is serenading a tiffin that his wife has made for him. And Lily, the girl in the book, she actually says to me, she says, if men valued the tiffin that their wives make as much as he does in that song, women's lives will be better. So she's approaching him from the perspective of appreciating women's care labor, right? And so I think in this feminist and female icon and in the Mr. Khan and Shah Rukh, those distinctions, I think there's something very important there about the agency of the female gaze, that you can construct him, and that not all women who are gushing over a man are fools who just seem to have been tricked or bewitched by some man who is so powerful. Uh, each one of us knows, that there are parts of it that's marketing. All the women in the book are picking up different pieces and they're constructing an icon that gives them delight, gives them joy, gives them comfort.
I'm glad it's a Jharkhandi sister who likes that movie, because it's a movie that no matter how many times I watch it, I always cry at the moment when he appears on stage and starts to match moves with her. I wanted to talk about female fandom because that's where the conversation is getting to, and it's not a very popular subject of study. I think not just globally, I mean, not just in India but globally. And one of the things you've said explaining it is because it seems so banal, right? We already have a culture that worships men, so what's the big deal about women mooning over a man who's already so great? Seems like a kind of an uncomplicated love. Not much to say there, but actually, there are few things about our culture that are so powerful as a phenomenon. I have written about male fandom, and I'm sure that you've read much more about male fandom in India. I remember writing about male fans of Salman Khan in small towns of North India, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, right? And one of the things that struck me as the most obvious was that they had to show it off. Like they were all over the place with it in the gyms. In fact, it created markets where none existed, of gyms and of these shops and these, like, bikes and clothes. They would organize events if a movie was out. They had this like great network, you know, intra-cities and inter-districts where people came together. They even like formed political parties, and I mean, some people even like found careers and made influence like that. And but when I read this book, it was very interesting for me how fandom plays out so differently for women, in that A, it can be almost dangerous. B, we're still living in a culture where, at least in my reporting experience, I mean, boyfriends expect that you share with them. Husbands expect that you are the first man that you ever fell in that they fell in love with. And I remember this moment from my own personal life. I'm sitting with a friend who, like me, is urban and educated and independent, and her partner is the same. And this is the first time that she's telling her husband about her love of Shah Rukh Khan growing up, and it's almost like she desired him, and so she's explaining that through her teenage years and then as a young woman. And I could see the partner get really uncomfortable, and it made me uncomfortable as well. And so, reading this book, I was just thinking, these women, I mean, hats off to them, because they have to hide the posters. Sometimes they have to secretly listen to the songs, or they don't, or sneak away to watch a movie. And you also need to have money in order to be a fan. So I wanted you to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's such a great story, and everywhere I want to say this again. Everywhere I went, and this has happened even as the book has come out. Anytime one starts to talk about a woman appreciating the male body, male behavior, you're critiquing masculinity, right? In a way, it just automatically, I mean, now we of course have a culture of just incels running the country. So I think part of it is just that you just have this constant fear of anyone critiquing this notion of, what a man is and what a man can do, especially women and women of a certain kind. That everywhere I went, Snigdha, what you just described, I've seen it everywhere. Everywhere I saw someone, a woman, express delight about Mr. Khan, I would find a man who would be willing to berate her for it, and then would also think that I was unserious and stupid for asking these questions, right? And the one thing at the end of this book that I really learned is I think there's something really powerful to study when you study really banal phenomena. The things that you think are just so obvious, that, oh, of course people like Shah Rukh, but actually if you start to listen to why these women like Shah Rukh and how much they have to struggle to watch a film. So one of the principal characters in my book is a girl who calls herself Manju. There's a reason why she calls herself Manju. She's a young Muslim woman growing up in rural Rampur in Uttar Pradesh. She makes she essentially does embroidery at home and earns about less than quarter of a minimum wage in her case. And what she does eventually with all the small amounts of money that she and her mother are making, along with other women in the village who are also doing embroidery work, is that they create almost like a film club. So once every few months, they will rent out a movie, bring someone from Bareilly actually who will bring like a little VCD player at that time, and they would watch a Shah Rukh film, and they would watch it inside the home because the cinema hall was ridiculously unsafe. There's data that shows in India 6 out of 10 people in an Indian cinema hall are men. There are women in my book who are actually slapped and, by their own mothers, face violence for actually going into a cinema hall because it's considered an unsafe masculine place, a place where men take their desires, lust, their time for leisure. It's not really seen as a place women should be. And as a consequence, just having fun is such a difficult task. And in our milieu, I think we think it's very easy, but it actually isn't, because even amongst the upper middle class or the lower middle class, access to mobile phones is heavily male. Access to the internet remains heavily male as well. Women's access to portals and windows to the world outside are so limited. And I think, in a way, what fandom is, the book is, to me, fandom is essentially, and I keep saying this, it's a device to actually study how much women still have to struggle in our country to just access the world outside the home, be it through media, be it through markets, be it through a cinema hall in this case. And the other issue here, Snigdha, which is really interesting to me, is that as we start to listen to the stories of the women in the book, why is it that they are so keen on fandom? For so many women, Shah Rukh was, and these are young women, they've grown up with him, they're all born in the sort of late 80s, early 80s in some cases. For all of them, he was essentially their first favorite of consequence. Almost is a very important part of their selfhood was, he is my favorite actor. So to nurse and indulge your own interests, as opposed, for example, Manju's brothers who would essentially tell her what film she could watch. She wasn't interested in that. She didn't want to bargain with them about what she could watch and what she couldn't watch. She didn't want to ask men to help her navigate fun. She wanted to do this on her own, And it's an extremely complex set of bargains through which she's able to have fun on her own terms. And you'll have to read the book to get a flavor of what I'm talking about. And she's not the only person. I mean, there are all these stories in the book where women constantly have to navigate permission, public space, all of these social constructs that are so loaded against them that make fun so difficult. So then obviously when fun is so difficult and then fun is being had, it's even more exhilarating, right? Which is why they all love Shah Rukh as much as they do, because it's so difficult to actually express and follow up and follow the actor that you want to. Um, and I think the book essentially tries to capture that exhilaration, because that exhilaration is so difficult to actually find, because of the way society and markets are organized.
And this must have been not an easy book to write. Some of the things that I'm most curious about are usually tackled in academic books, and I have to read them for if I'm writing an article. But those are not books that I'll save to read on a lazy weekend. But this is something that I did, and it's a book about very serious subjects like labor and economy and policy making. So I wanted you to talk just about the process of reporting and writing and fitting it all together.
So I think the first thing, as I said, because the book is a series of accidents, I never went in wearing a researcher hat. I went in wearing the hat of a fangirl because I love talking to people. I mean, anyone who knows me here knows I love talking about Mr. Khan. And if you talk to me about Shah Rukh, I think I just come alive, and otherwise I'm quite a dull person. And I think so. I think the one thing I will say is I think I went into the book, for me, what was very interesting was I wanted to talk to people who are often people that social science researchers like myself, we would always talk to them about deprivation, poverty, tell me how terrible things are. And of course, things are very terrible. But I wanted to not enter the research process in a way through that. I wanted to talk to people about fun. I wanted to enter their lives through fun, through delight, through joy. And then when you start to talk to people about fun, delight, and joy, you realize actually then they will start telling you about their problems with economic independence, with intimacy, their relationships. And I think the book, completely by accident, actually revealed that to me. I didn't know that going into it. So I think that's one thing I want to say. The other, Snigdha, I have to say that this is really an ode to slow literature because, I mean, I have been following these women from 2006 all the way, and I thought in 2019 when I gave the draft to Shruti Devi, who claims to be my agent, and I can see her here. She claims to be my agent, but she's very much co-creator and guide for this project. Um, I thought I was done, and then the pandemic hit, and then obviously I needed to also follow up with what was happening to some of the women during the time of the pandemic, essentially for the sense of completeness in a way of the story. And as a consequence, I kept rewriting. It was a very long, arduous process of sort of back and forth and trying to shape it. But the one principle I had when I was shaping the writing of the book is that it would be, to me at least, a book of economics. And not a book of economics. I think there's a typical book of economics which is written by a bunch of really stuffy, powerful men, which is written for also a bunch of stuffy, powerful men, giving them advice about what to do with the economy, and you're always advising chief ministers and prime ministers and so on. This is a book of economics which essentially is meant for the general public, anyone who can pick it up and read it, and it tries to be accessible. But I really wanted to tell a story of what is happening to the economy if you started to think of the economy the way feminists do, where it's not factories and fields, but the economy is the home. Most women in this country continue to work from home. The home is the principal workplace and a productive workplace, which, of course, most policymakers don't treat it as such yet. And I wanted to just think carefully about how do I tell a story, a more intimate story of the economy through these narratives that I was really privileged to collect and hear and then have access and permission to write about. And I think in the writing of it, the economics of it, be it economic theory, the language of taxes, incentives, why is it that women are not being able to access the money to watch Mr. Khan? What's happening in the labor force? That was really important to me, but to tell the reader a story in a much more accessible and, as you said, like a weekend read way, as opposed to in this very stuffy technocratic way. And I say this in the book, the economy, it is a social construct. Some of us tend to think that the economy is this soulless set of transactions. The stock market is soulless, but the economy is a set of relationships. It's all of us here. It's our moods, it's our predilections, and they guide our ability to be productive, our ability to make things, to consume things, to buy things. And the economy has a very rich emotional and ethical life. And to me, I think the book through Mr. Khan, as I said, it's just accident, sheer accident that I discovered that all conversation about him would suddenly teach me so much more about the economy. Uh, it was a way for me to tell you the story about what sentiments and those the economy holds, right? And what does it feel like when you're struggling to find a job? What does it feel like when you're being taxed for having a good job by your family, which is constantly happening? And I think in the writing of it, sort of economic literature really played a very strong role. I mean, that is what I'm trained in, but I wanted to use those theories and constructs in a way that would just make it easier, though, for people to access and understand what was happening to women in the economy and the female gaze towards the economy. Not only because I am a woman, but also because all the stories that I was hearing was a bunch of women trying to tell us what happens when they try and access the economy. In some cases, just to watch an actor they want to, or to make money to watch an actor they want to, and broader stories of their own economic lives.
What did your reporting and research tell you about the men? Because they must be coming up in conversations all the time, even if you didn't speak to them personally. There must be again like a you know wide range amongst them, but we are talking about um, men like come up in the book quite frequently, as either Shah Rukh Khan, his icon, or the men in these women's lives, and there are some issues that seem quite obvious and some not so much. And if you could just describe some of your broad takeaways.
Yeah.
AKA, what's wrong with
What's wrong with men? What's wrong with Indian men? Yeah, they're not Shah Rukh. That's certainly I think what's wrong with them. They should all be put through a regimen. But no, but on a serious note, one thing I did realize, I initially thought when I was having, when I was doing these interviews and from 2006 to 2013, I had a bunch of notes. There were lots of notes. I've had no social life, and as a consequence, through this period. And when I looked at the notes in 2013, one thing I realized was because of Mr. Khan's icon, which was this romantic superhero of South Asia, I was surprised at how much women would use that icon to essentially start to critique the men in their real lives. I mean, I knew that they were talking about their economic lives, about access to money, media, public space, all of that, what we've talked about before. But I was surprised at how open so many of these women that I interviewed and spoke to were about how terrible their real men were, which is why they were looking to this fantastical figure. And I think there are sort of three elements to that, and it's very class specific, Snigdha, based on only the stories I know and everything that I've read and is reflected in the book. I think amongst English speaking upper middle class elite women, typically upper caste, what's happened is that because of liberalization, these women's economic power, even if some of them may not hold jobs on their own, but because their families have done better, the economic power that they hold is higher. And as a result, in certainly very small urban enclaves, and these are women who love Shah Rukh, this is a huge coterie of the Shah Rukh fan base. I'm part of that. You realize that you no longer need to settle for the kind of man that your mother would have probably needed to settle for, because she could just not be secure and survive on her own. She needed male income, she needed status through marriage. All of that has changed. And these women often had jobs of their own. They were interested in cultivating professional identities, and they were struggling to find men who would support them in that. In fact, one thing that I constantly kept hearing, it's in the book, especially in the first section of the book, is about elite upper class women who are fans of Mr. Khan, and they would keep telling me that they felt that men in the mating market are not comfortable with women who are their economic equals. They want, in fact, a character in the book, she's a product of IIT-IIM. She says, men want me to look at them the way I look at Shah Rukh, that he should be this great man, and I should just constantly be in thrall of him, and I should not treat him as an equal real person. And there's this strange mismatch in how women have really evolved because of, I think, economy, liberalization, access to media, what's happened to all of us in the upper class. And masculinity is yet to really adapt to that change in demand, right? And I think there's a lot of frustrations that I would constantly hear. And I think men came up in that aspect. And there are great stories. There's a very personal story that I tell of my own self, of an ex of mine, and I call him the one in the book. And I actually think that it was sheer mismatch, because I think this is someone who's just so used to hearing yes all the time and in his life that he just didn't know what to do with someone like me who wanted a job and wanted to talk about their job applications, and that was sort of considered bad manners at dinner tables that I was with him. And so there's a lot of this sort of, drawing room comedy of errors and intimacy that's really compromised because masculinity just can't handle this change in femininity. That's one. But if you look at sort of the second section of the book is essentially about women who are come from trader caste families, the first generation of the middle class. Um, there's a great story in there about, I think it's a great story, of a woman who runs away from her family because she doesn't want to marry the man that the family has chosen for her. She becomes
It's one of the greatest stories.
Yeah, I know, she's your favorite, right? Her name's Gold, and she's an in-flight attendant, and she runs away from home to essentially try and find a husband of her own. And she's miserable trying to find a husband of her own. And what she says is that she says, I gave up conformity in her small town to find sexual and romantic freedom in Gurgaon, which is where she was. But she says that the mating market is so loaded in men's favor because, one, the reproductive hygiene issues, because men would run away. She tells stories, it's all in the book. Men would run away at the thought and notion of having to buy a condom, any conversation around abortions or anything to do with the physical bodily health of women. Men and partners would just disappear, and they were very uncomfortable. Men would lie even if they had multiple partners. There was this strange adherence to a sociopathy, which had become very normal, where you wouldn't tell each other about how you were living your life or how you were organizing your romantic lives. And Gold was no sexual Puritan. She essentially said that there's nothing wrong with playing the field, but you must play the field with some honesty. And she felt that that just wasn't happening. And I think in this new middle class, where a new kind of mating market occurred, many people chose to give up arranged marriages, but they were still struggling to deal with the fact that um, the market very much was for men because of just sheer nature of the body and the female body and what that meant as well, right? And the fact, again, I think that masculinity is yet to adapt even amongst the women and the men that Gold was trying to find a partner with. Where I thought that the real change has completely happened in the conversation around men was amongst the low income and working class communities that I went to, because there essentially so many of the younger women were now thinking of not finding a husband. They are, I mean, one of the principal characters in the book is a woman called Zahira. She's a community organizer in Ahmedabad. Left her husband. It was an abusive, violent marriage. And she has a daughter, Meenal, who I've seen grow up because I met her in 2006. She was 10 years old and now she's a grown woman. And she refuses to marry. She says, I will only marry for love. And this idea of marrying for love, she's picked it up from Shah Rukh's films because, there's a kind of, there's a film, Dil To Pagal Hai, which is her favorite film. And at the very end, there's a line which actually comes in English, which only the daughter, Meenal, could read because she can read English, but her mother can't. Her mother loves the movies as well, but she thinks of them as fantasy. But to Meenal, this is reality. And she says that, of course, you can only marry for love.
The line?
The line is, it's not come fall in love because that's DDLG. I think everyone must find someone. It's like everyone must find a partner. I think this gentleman knows the line. But do you know what the line is? Made for you. Yeah, someone somewhere is made for you. There we go. Thank you. He had his hand raised. Yeah. Thank you. And I think that's, that she read that line and she believes in the totalitarian hegemony of romantic love, that, you must find love of a certain kind and then you will marry. And this was completely alien from, her mother's family or even her friends. And I think there's a excitement about meeting men, and there's an excitement about, there was not as much complaining there. In fact, there it was just a phase of exploration. So I think this conversation around men is very class specific. But as for what's wrong with men, I mean, one, I said in the beginning, they're not Shah Rukh, but I think largely, on a serious note, I think what's happening is that we have women who, with greater economic independence, certainly in the book, and they're struggling to hold on to that economic independence. The need and the terms of dependence between men and women have changed so dramatically in these kinds of equations And I don't think we have a conversation on masculinity or men who've really adapted and changed to that enough. And they're not helping at home at all. I mean, you just, it's all over the book. Men just do not step in to help in reproductive labors. And you're not, and there was a lot of complaining about that, obviously.
Right. Only you can say things like totalitarian hegemony of love. So
And get away with it.
thank you for that. Well, you didn't get away with this because I just called it out.
But it's a good phrase.
It is a good phrase.
Yeah, you'll be using it. Yeah.
You will be using it. I just to take that forward, there is also a generational aspect to female fandom of Shah Rukh Khan, and I'm sure of other stars as well. You you reported the book over 15 years. I mean, women have fanned over Shah Rukh Khan for much longer. Um, and you say that for the newer generation of women, the Gen Z, they want to be Shah Rukh Khan. They don't want to marry Shah Rukh Khan. What does that mean?
Yeah, and in fact, I'll use this example of Zahira again, just to sort of, so to her, she loves Shah Rukh. She's now, I think, in her early 40s, late 30s, early 40s. She loves Shah Rukh as this idea of the benevolent patriarch. He will take care of you, he'll provide for you, but you will still need his permission, of course, to sort of live the life that you want to live. But he will grant you that permission and he will let you do the things that you want to do. So there was this idea that women can live the life that they want to, provide their husbands and their partners are supportive. So, but you would still need support and you would need benevolence in the man you love. And so she loved him for that because he represents that he would support her desire to rest, to have fun, to work, to do what she wants to do. And to Zahira, the mother, that is what Mr. Khan represents, and she loves him for that. Her daughter, Meenal, she did not see him like that at all. She saw him essentially as a boy who had gone to the city for a job. She wanted to go to the city to have a job. She saw him as someone who was loved, who had status, who was successful. She wanted to have love, status, and success. She saw him as someone who actually she thought she should be as successful as this man. And to her, he was a very different icon. So she wanted to be him. She had no interest in marrying him. I think she'd love to marry someone like him, but she was more interested in being him. And Snigdha, the interesting follow up to that, which I noticed much, much more recently, is that many of Meenal's friends, and in fact, girls who are younger than Meenal, girls who are now teenagers in the slums of Delhi. And so, one of the characters in the book is a woman called Sandhya, who's a part time domestic worker. She works in a Bengali neighborhood in Delhi, lives in a Jugi cluster, which has just been upgraded in South Delhi. And her daughter is obsessed with Priyanka Chopra's Instagram. So for her now, and Sandhya is a huge Shah Rukh fan. She struggles, and the story in the book is actually about her struggle to just buy a television and to hold on to the TV and what that entails, and also a negotiation with her husband. And you should read the stories in the book to have a sense of what she ends up doing with her television. But what's fascinating is her daughter she was not a big Shah Rukh fan. She admired him, but she loved Priyanka Chopra, and she said to me when I was asking her, well, she loved her because now women can be that successful and women can be independent. Women can marry late. She noticed that about Miss Chopra. She said that noticed that she married late in life after she'd worked for a while. All these women are now working after they've been married as well. And one of the things she said to me, and I write about this in the book, it really struck me. She said that, she married a foreigner because no Indian man would support a successful woman like her. And this is, first generation young woman who's speaking English in her family, studying in a school in Delhi. And you start to see that these scripts of icons now are really shifting, right? So moving from Shah Rukh as the benevolent patriarch to Shah Rukh as a symbol of success, and now to Deepika Padukone or Priyanka Chopra, who are actually, I would contend, the next Shah Rukh, or I think bigger than him perhaps, because essentially they now define female aspiration, not to want a man who support you, but to just live the life that you want to, and you see that shift very strongly, and I describe it in the book.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I wanted to ask how much more time before I should, because I do have one more question. And it's about Shah Rukh Khan. Um, his journey is always been described as or described alongside the journey of New India. By New India, I mean the India after the liberal reforms in the 90s. And um, the India of today is very different to the India of then, the India that made him SRK. And I think he was reminded of that himself very recently. And I know that you have said that people still love Shah Rukh, and of course they do. We saw huge outpourings of love for him, but I also noticed a lot of hate from for him, especially coming from people, including in my own family and social networks, from people who would have otherwise or would earlier would not have seen him like that. So I wanted to ask you if you really believe that his icon can defy India's ongoing illiberal turn.
I think he has, and I'm waiting actually to see what happens next. I mean, his tweet is the most, I think, awaited event, at least, I think, in popular culture for a while, whatever he does next. But I do want to start by just acknowledging that it makes me very sad, and the book was written before all of this occurred, and it didn't surprise me, the nastiness that I think, yeah, we see it, right? And we know now, I think, in which direction we are headed, sadly. But it makes me sad that the most garrulous icon of liberalization, I mean, he was always on TV speaking. I remember my teenage years or even being in my 20s, and Shah Rukh Khan was always talking. I mean, he was talking to the media, he was talking about himself, and he was always saying these fabulous things. Like, just as an aside, my favorite Shah Rukh Khan quote is in 2015, he was promoting a film called Dilwale, and a woman happened a journalist actually in the press conference. This is just an aside, but I really have to get this out there. She asked him, she was complaining about actually not being able to hold on to a job, which is very interesting that she directly asked him. And he said, ladies, I have one piece of advice for you. He said, don't give up your day job for a night husband. And I think that, which icon is saying, I mean, it sounds bizarre, but who is saying these things? And, so the interviews are just when the book has so many quotes of so many interviews and lectures and things that he said. And it's really sad that now our most garrulous icon of liberalization, when the economy was speaking and he was speaking, is now utterly silent, and the economy is also in its doldrums right now. And I sort of see, to me, he really is the bearer of market reform, and I think there's something very deeply connected there, along with, of course, a religious illiberal turn. And it is sad that he is silent, and I'm really looking forward to when he will not be. And as I said, his tweet or whatever he does next is, I think, one of the most awaited events in popular culture right now. But Snigdha, having said that, I will also say 15 years, and even now, I talk to people who love him, and none of these women ever reduced him to his religious identity. They see him as transcending these fixed, narrow notions of identity. They see him as the ideal man. He's witty, he's wise, he's wildly sexy, he's fun. Nobody ever talked about that. The only time, and I mentioned this in the book, his religion came up was actually a young Muslim woman who was a fan of his. She mentioned to me she was very upset that he did not speak up during the NRC protests. And she felt very let down. But it took her 2 minutes, and I mentioned this in the book, it took her 2 minutes to then add that she said that, well, maybe he's doing something and maybe he's doing it quietly, and maybe it's a very difficult time for a Muslim hero to speak. And she was right. I mean, look at what happened, right? With just the events that occurred after, and he's also been attacked in the past anytime he speaks about religious intolerance. And I think his silence is very salient. And he's always been an icon who tells different stories of India. I think he told a story of market reform and liberalization. And now I think he's telling us a very different story. And I'm curious to see what happens with Pathan. I think it's going to be a big giant hit. So I think there's space for him. And the one thing I will close with is it's very difficult for me to treat him as an analytical object, right? Because like I'm a nutty fan. Like I can't do that. But there are people who can, and I was very fortunate for the book to interview people who are film critics and writers and film producers as well. And one of the things I learned from them, and there's a quote by Nasreen Munni Kabir in the book. She says, he's like the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles had good songs, bad songs, but the Beatles will be the Beatles, and Shah Rukh will always be Shah Rukh. And I think that there is a evergreen part of his icon because he's etched in our memories. be it nostalgia, be it marking milestones of our own country's history, our own personal lives. People have been married because of movies, and I think there's a tremendous power that those experiences hold. We saw them when the crisis erupted after his son's unfortunate arrest and all the shameful incidents that happened after. And we saw that there was this volume of support. So I remain hopeful, and I'm waiting for the tweet.
I'll end here with a huge recommendation to all of you to read the book if you haven't. We begin taking questions, so feel free.
First of all, thank you for doing this. I mean, I've thought about this for years, like someone should just write a book on the phenomenon. Um, you just referenced waiting for this tweet. Do you think we've seen the last of Shah Rukh, the public intellectual? Because that's that's the part of him I think I and many people like us enjoy the most. I know you talked about his interviews being the most important part, but do you think we're done with that?
Hi. First of all, I think we should do this every other afternoon, just sit and talk about Shah Rukh Khan. So, one of the things, and as someone who's like, I mean, I guess more, I would claim in love with Shah Rukh Khan. So, one of the things, and we often talk about how Shah Rukh Khan is our longest relationship, right? It's complicated also because as we grow up, some of the movies we love, like they don't age well, right? But I feel in some way Shah Rukh Khan movies have also changed, like be it like Dear Zindagi and all. So were there any conversations with the people you reported on and how they see Shah Rukh Khan's own politics evolving when it comes to women or like sexuality and all of that?
Can I just respond to me?
Sure.
Yeah. I think to answer your question, no, I don't. Well, a couple of things. I think that the way media now or the internet works, his comments and his thoughts on the economy, on liberalism, they're just available for everyone to see. I mean, the book is full of quotes and, there are all these interviews. I do expect that at some point, whenever, and I'm excited to see and hear what happens. And I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, I wish I did, but I'm not on the inside track of this at all. And so much like you, I'm just sitting and waiting. I can't imagine that an icon who has been so actively engaged in thinking about structures of our society, about technology. I mean, I'd request everyone to just go listen to his TED talk. It's just remarkable. He does this parallel between automation and human love and life, and it's really interesting the parallels that he's drawing. And so I think someone who does that is part of their creative body of work, because it's obviously also part of the performance, right? Because he's performing when he's doing all of this. I can't imagine that part of the performance will stop, and I really look forward to it. And I know, much like you, that many of the women I interviewed who are from our class, the interviews and those comments are much more what they remember. His comments about fidelity, his comments about the economy, his comments about being Muslim, all of those thoughts, right? And I think that's part of the icon and the performance. So I'm curious to see what happens next, and I don't think that there's going to be. I mean, the silence can't be so prolonged, but who knows? We'll see. I think to answer your question, to me, and I write about this in the book, there's sort of three phases if you look at the men he's played. I mean, they're all vulnerable. They're very vulnerable to the gaze of the other. They're shedding tears, all of that. But there are three phases. The first phase is him playing a pretty terrible guy who's essentially stalking, harming, not really being, very dangerous and yet very lonely. The second is, the patriarch who loves, right? So the considerate patriarch, the wide open arms. He will love you. He will love you. He will love your mother. He will love the sister. All of that, right? Like there's this whole performance around love. But the third, and actually, I love the recent phase. I know the movies haven't done well, and many of the fans I spoke to actually also were quite surprised. And one of the, I go to watch Jab Harry. I met Sejal with Gold, who's in the book, and I write about that. Because the third phase is him playing narcissistic men who really can't handle the fact that they've now fallen for women who have higher status than him. And all the characters, be it Zero, be it, the Harry that he plays to Anushka Sharma, Sejal, they are all, in a way, men. And, we were talking about that crisis of masculinity, right? Like he's, I think, trying in these films to at least give voice to that in some way, and he's portraying it. Some people like that performance, some people don't. I do. And I think fans do recognize that. But I also think with fandom, there's this time is no longer. I mean, you can go back and watch what you want to, right? So I know so many fans who, when they feel terrible, There's a woman in the book who says she watches Kal Ho Na Ho anytime, and she says that anytime he dies, I feel like I'm dying with him. And when she really wants a good cry, when she wants to feel a certain way, she will watch that film. There are people I know who will specifically look up songs in DDLJ or specific interviews. So I think the way all of us are consuming now media allows us to just move back and forth, right? So we don't necessarily need to just follow in trend in time with what he's doing. And I think as the internet starts to become more democratic in its access, you start to see that as well in different communities. So I think people pick up the evolution, but then people just want to see what they want to see, and then they'll engage with it that way.
Thank you. I wanted to ask these women you talk about watching Shah Rukh Khan, how do they see the heroines in these movies? Are they women they identify with, see as rivals, as something I must be like to get Shah Rukh Khan, or do they just not see them at all?
No, they see them. In fact, sorry, should we take another question or should I just?
I think answer this one first, then we'll take.
Okay. No, it's a great question. One of the things I actually do in the book is I measure the amount of time women speak in his films compared to other big hits of his contemporary other actors or some of the biggest Bollywood hits. And actually, women speak far more in his films. They're more present, they're more engaged. And I'll take you back to DDLJ, and all the women I spoke to would always talk about DDLJ. It's their favorite film, invariably. And they would always talk about Kajol and DDLJ because actually, if you look at the love story in DDLJ, it starts with Kajol Simran. She's written a poem about a man that she wants to meet, Andekha Anjana, the stranger that she wants to meet. And then, in a way, Mr. Khan only concretizes that fantasy. So actually, it's very much the woman taking the lead in defining what she wants. The film ends somewhere else when it comes to female agency, but that's a different point. And so I think all the women were very actively consuming what the women were doing because the reason they liked Mr. Khan was not just because he's just there on his own, but because of the way he was engaging with women, the way he was talking to women, as I mentioned, appreciating the tiffin, talking to them, listening to them, being considerate, right? And being in a film where actually women are speaking and he's just sitting and listening sometimes. And I think women really saw that. As for whether they related to the women in the movies, I think there's beauty makes it such that they were essentially aspirational ideas of how beautiful women could be because beauty is seen as the ultimate path to power. I mean, I think that's still a script that holds. And I would constantly hear that, well, you need to be as beautiful as a Bollywood actress to find a man like Shah Rukh. And I think that beauty and scripts around beauty are very, very prominent when we were thinking about these women. And they could relate to the fantasy that all these women had about a man who would love them and take care of them. And I think that's the way they were relating to the women. And I think upper class women didn't really identify with the women at all in these movies because I have interviews with people a lot like us who would much more identify perhaps with women in American TV shows or more in the media from the West than perhaps the women that were being portrayed in these films. Women from different backgrounds did relate to them, but they saw them very much as an aspiration of a beauty ideal of what you needed to look like to find happiness and to find love.
I had two questions actually. First, did you get to meet Shah Rukh ever, or did you try interviewing him for the book? And secondly, I was just trying to think of the emotion that his movies sort of evoked in me, and I think for me it was patriotism because it's Swades and Chakte. So I was just wondering if that something came up, and what do you think about that? Yeah.
Let me start with the patriotism. It didn't come up. No. In fact, people would love his films. People would love Swades. The only time it maybe somewhat came up is one of the women in the book is an IIT IIM graduate, and she chooses to stay in India and work in India. She doesn't want to work anywhere else. But she never related that with Mr. Khan. I mean, to her, he represented something else to her. So honestly, it didn't come up in conversations. But I've heard what you're saying from some people, but not in the stories that I've captured or listened to over the past decade. I have not met him. I wish I could meet him. If anyone can help me meet him, this is an open invitation. Help me meet him. I know that my publishers have been kind enough to send the book to Mannat. And we were joking that actually it's almost like it just says Shah Rukh Khan Mannat and you send the book and there's only one place where it will go. But the book is also unfortunate. It was always supposed to come out at this time, and it's come out at a time which has been very difficult for him, as we were talking. about. So I remain hopeful. Inshallah, at some point it will actually reach him, and then I'm looking forward to telling more of the tale.
Your book is about so many things, and I'm reading it. I've gotten just beyond the accountant, and I don't know what to comment on first. That you just make so many interesting insights. But and your book is certainly about economics and the richness that really good, insightful, qualitative work can tell you about economics. And one of the things I really appreciate is how you give women a voice to voice their insights into how their own situations could be better. And particularly, I'm thinking about the accountant and what he says. I mean, in contrary to sort of, middle-aged, economists, as you say, writing papers for other middle-aged economists, males on both sides. She comes up with a lot of interesting policy suggestions, scholarships for girls who want to study accounting, hostels for girls who need to study somewhere else. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of suggestions the women in your interviews made to, in terms of like how their situations could have been better, and situations of women like them?
That's such a great question. Thank you. One of the things that actually I'm trying to push with the story in the book is something I constantly heard from almost all the women in the book is that even with the best infrastructure, the best policies that support women in jobs, the best innovations, if families continue to make women feel unloved for pursuing professional paths and for pursuing an identity which is separate from motherhood and marriage, working outside the home will always create mental health problems and stress for women. And I think that if we start to now think a bit carefully about what policy levers do we have to change some of these interpersonal dynamics, and I think there then the onus becomes much more on the supporting the infrastructure of care, supporting the infrastructure of elderly care, domestic care, childcare, incredibly so. And the accountant, I felt, had very useful suggestions. She essentially said, well, you should make it easier and cheaper for women to access job information, access transport vouchers, which many governments now are actually doing. But she also had one very radical suggestion, which I fundamentally believe. I mean, she basically said that we need to now start having jobs that are reserved in some places just for women. Because she said if you start to then change the supply side dynamics, the demand side dynamics from the sectors and firms, families will then have to adapt and respond to those kinds of incentives. And I'm actually one of those believers. I think we should retire men out of public life for some time. I think that, and I don't know whether that'll make it better or worse. I really don't know, but I think it'll be different. And it's worth trying to see what happens. But this is a fictitious reality, but I don't think will come to be. But many of the women in the book actually said that we should essentially make sure that even within reserved seats, which there are in India, there are reserved seats, that there should be primacy given to female candidates. Because if you don't start to change the way firms are recruiting and the incentive for firms to recruit, families then will not see the value in changing the way they treat women and love women for following professional paths. So it's funny that intimacy and the economy actually are levers that are, you can change the way your intimate life functions because of the market, and the market can also change the way your intimate life feels. And I think that's something, when we think about solutions, we need to think a lot more carefully about the home and about how we can make sure that firms demand more female labor.
थैंक यू मैम। मेरा जो सवाल है वो ये कि अभी जैसे आपने कहा कि आप शाहरुख से कभी मिली नहीं है, कभी जब आप उनको उनसे मिलने का मौका मिलेगा तो एज एन ऑथर आप क्या जानना चाहेंगी उनके बारे में? क्योंकि जिस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में आप उन्हें देख रही हैं अपनी बुक में, या आप उन्हें देखती आई हैं, विमेन एजेंसी और विमेन वॉइस जो है, आपने शाहरुख के जो फैन बनना है उसमें देखा, तो इसके बारे में थोड़ा सा बताएंगे? अगर आप मिलेंगी तो फिर उनसे क्या सवाल जानना चाहेंगी, क्या पूछना चाहेंगी?
मैं आपसे एक सच बात बताऊं, मैं जब उनसे मिलूंगी मैं कुछ नहीं कह पाऊंगी। मुझे नहीं लगता, स्निग्धा मुझे जानती है, मुझे लगता है कि जब मैं उनको देखूंगी या तो मतलब या तो ऐसा कुछ होगा कि उनको देखते देखते ज्यादा मुझे कुछ कहने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ेगी, या वो शायद देख के मेरे पागलपन को वो सोचेंगे कि शायद ये कम बोलें तो बेहतर है। तो ऐसा कुछ हो सकता है। मैं उनसे कुछ सवाल नहीं पूछना चाहती। मैं ये जरूर चाहती हूँ कि ये किताब उनके पास पहुंचे, क्योंकि मुझे लगता है हमने एक एक शाहरुख हम सब ने एक साथ बनाया है। वो है मिस्टर खान, वो एक हैं अपने आप अपनी जिंदगी जी रहे हैं, लेकिन जितनी भी औरतें हैं इस किताब में और हम सब हैं, हम सब ने अपनी जिंदगी से अलग अलग दायरों में हमने उनको बनाया है। इट्स को क्रिएशन, एंड I would only want him to know that this is something that we have co-created, and the book essentially captures that. I really, उससे ज़्यादा ना ही मैं उनसे कुछ सवाल पूछ सकती हूँ, ना ही मैं सोच सकती हूँ मैं क्या ये सारा जो अभी मैं इतना बोल रही हूँ, वॉइस, एजेंसी, फेमिनिज्म, उस वक्त सब कुछ कहीं और चला जाएगा, बिकॉज दैट इज एज मच आई एडमायर हिम दैट मच। तो मैं अगर सच सच बोलूँ तो मुझे लगता है मैं ज़्यादा कुछ उस वक्त बोल ही नहीं पाऊंगी, बट थैंक यू फॉर द क्वेश्चन।